All right, so I got a bunch of different Israel updates that I want to get to here with you guys, starting off with the biggest news over the last couple of days, as Israel is deciding to launch a massive offensive into Rafah. And so as we were all sort of like at home yesterday here in the United States watching the Super Bowl, a Super Bowl in which Israel was even airing advertisements, they decided to use that as a moment when I guess people were distracted to launch this huge offensive and bombing campaign that is pointed out here killed. I've seen anywhere between like 67 to this says 77 who were killed, as well as dozens injured in some of these airstrikes on Rafah after multiple homes and mosques were also targeted. And of course, the death toll is likely going to rise from that. And so just to give you guys a perspective in terms of where Rafah is and what the current situation in Rafah is. So this is a map of Gaza. Obviously, the entirety of the northern portion of Gaza above this red line was evacuated, was forcefully, Palestinians were forced from their homes, and then the entirety of North Gaza was basically leveled to the ground and is entirely uninhabitable at this point. Then they told people to move here to Khan Yunis, saying that's going to be the new safe zone, just chasing people around, lying about where the safe zones are, because there are no safe zones in Gaza. There haven't been since day one. And then they said, no, Hamas HQ is actually down here in Khan Yunis, so everybody has to go to Rafah. And this says, in this map, 171,000 residents. Since October 7th, it's now gotten to the point where half the population of Gaza is in Rafah. Over 1 million people are trapped inside this tiny southern portion that are, basically living in like tent cities, where they're makeshift tents and there's mud everywhere and they're packed in as tightly as you can possibly imagine. So now you go 10x the amount of the original population that was in Rafah, and they're basically just pushed up into the border. And you get this statement here from the official Israeli Prime Minister account. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has ordered the IDF and the security establishment to submit to the cabinet a combined plan for evacuating the population and destroying the Hamas battalions. Guys, there is nowhere to evacuate to. This is it. The only other place you could possibly evacuate to would be inside of Egypt, which, as we know from many previous statements from top Israeli politicians, is kind of their plan. It's been their plan for a long time. How many times have I covered statements from not just Bezalel Smotrich and Itar BenGavier and the more fringe, extreme terrorist right wing of Netanyahu's coalition, but also, high-ranking politicians like Netanyahu himself, who have floated the idea of pushing them into the Sinai Peninsula, right? And so, you have all this backlash that I'm going to get to here coming from Egypt, which is where, the border with Rafah is, to this offensive, but they're going forward with this. This is even something that the Biden administration pretended like they were against, and I'll tell you about that here in a minute. But they're deciding to launch forward with this. This could not be a worse situation in terms of the humanitarian aspect of this on the ground, in terms of the amount of people who are immediately going to be at risk if they do launch a massive ground invasion and constant airstrikes. But they say here, Israel frees 2 hostages. Gaza officials say at least 67 killed in this most recent assault. So, look, guys, they say that they freed 2 hostages. Okay, that at this point has been confirmed. They've killed 3 hostages. The Israeli military has killed 3 of their own hostages inside of Gaza. So now I think the total amount of hostages that they have saved through these kinds of military operations is now equal to the amount that they've killed as a part of their military operations. So you saved 2 people in this raid, while you also killed 67 other people, right? And keep in mind, we had a temporary ceasefire that was put in place where dozens of hostages were exchanged on either side. That's the only viable path to actually get the hostages home in a reasonable way, in a reasonable capacity. And Hamas put a deal on the table that Israel rejected that would have involved the return of every single one of the hostages that are still inside Gaza. And so again, I make this point over and over again, but the Israeli government under Netanyahu, they don't care about the hostages. They would rather prolong this war, expand this war, in order to save their own political careers. Because he knows as soon as this war is over, if they did agree to a ceasefire deal to get all the hostages back, then his own political career is over. And he may even be facing jail times with all of the charges that have been levied against Netanyahu, right? So they're choosing to sacrifice the hostages, okay? Just be very clear about that. And so I got some video here from the aftermath of some of these strikes inside of Rafah. If we can go ahead and play this one. I'm going to try to keep it on low sound here, but you can see some of the targets here, right? Little children. This girl looks like she got some injury to her eye. It looks like a mother here, another child just covered in blood, and I'm sure that YouTube is going to demonetize me for this, so, it is what it is, but I feel like showing these kinds of images, at some point you kind of have to, right? Because it's one thing to talk about statistics all day long, but I mean, these are real people, right? 67 killed in just that one operation, and there was over 100 killed, if not hundreds, in other bombing campaigns at the same time that just didn't happen to be inside of Rafah, right? And so now we get to the Biden aspect of this. I mean, this was just a couple days ago. Biden tells Bibi, no Rafah operation without plan to protect Palestinian civilians. So Bibi took this statement from Joe Biden. They did a phone call apparently, and he proceeded to, as he has been doing, give Biden a double middle finger straight to the face and ignore everything that he says, and proceeded with this operation with no plan. The plan, I guess, is to evacuate them into the ocean. That's Bibi's plan for the civilians inside of Rafah or into the Sinai Peninsula. I mean, that's the only thing that has actually been floated. There is no plan to reasonably take any measure of care for the Palestinian civilians inside of Rafah. And I mean, this is obviously just because the Joe Biden administration, self-admittedly, does not want to apply any sort of strings attached to the aid that we are giving them, right? It is full diplomatic cover. It is endless billions of dollars that we are giving them in military aid and otherwise. I mean, it is full-throated support with no checks whatsoever. So if you're not using any leverage to try to get Bibi to bend to your will or what you want him to do or don't want him to do inside of Gaza, then he's just going to ignore you. And rightfully so from his perspective. Why the fuck should anybody listen to you if you don't use any of the leverage that you have at your disposal? So, I mean, just more meaningless bullshit here from the Biden administration. And he also said this, I mean, this was in the same press conference where he was furiously going back and forth with reporters about how he's not senile, he's not too old to do the job, right? And he had that slip up where he called El Sisi the president of Mexico. He's the president of Egypt, right? And, as a part of that, he also said the Israeli response to Hamas in Gaza has been over the top. Okay, so it's been so over the top that, and we had another one of these reports was just, it just baffles you, right? I mean, I've seen dozens of these kinds of reports here from the Daily Beast. Biden's getting closer to calling Netanyahu out. Oh, he's frustrated again. Biden's big mad at Bibi, right? So saying they're going over the top, oh, behind the scenes, he's so frustrated with Bibi for not listening to him. I mean, it's all just meaningless. It is utterly meaningless. You're not using any of the leverage that you have in order to get him to fall in line. We've seen previous presidents do this. We've seen even like right-wing presidents like Ronald Reagan threaten to cut off aid, get the Israeli prime minister on the phone and threaten them with that leverage, and then they immediately change course. I mean, it's not complicated. It's just that Biden either doesn't really care about actually doing something to help Palestinian civilians, or, he believes in what Bibi is doing. There's really no other option on the table. I mean, it's gotten to a completely absurd point, right? So saying, oh, they're going over the top, what are you going to do about it? Nothing? Oh, okay, so don't even say it at that point. Just say you full-throatedly support every single thing that Israel is doing, because that's, in effect, exactly what you're doing, right? And so we did have a response here, as I said, from Egypt, who are threatening to actually suspend a key peace treaty with Israel. They're talking about the Camp David Accords, guys. This is like 50 years ago that we're talking about. And Egypt is now threatening to withdraw from the Camp David Accords if Israel pushes into Rafah on its border, which they're now saying they're going to do. So just a little bit on that. They say Egypt is threatening to suspend its peace treaty with Israel if Israeli troops are sent into the densely populated Gaza border town of Rafah, where it says fighting could force the closure of the besieged territory's main aid supply route, two Egyptian officials and Western diplomats said on Sunday. So, I mean, think about the lack of aid that has gotten into Gaza recently, right? And we've talked about all these stories of Israeli civilians taking to the border and desperately trying to, block any sort of aid from getting into Gaza. I mean, think about that, guys. Israeli civilians, obviously with the tacit approval of the IDF, of the Israeli government, just going out like on a normal day, just choosing to go out and to help starve the people of Gaza, right? And now you're talking about taking that already horrific situation that is arguably the world's worst humanitarian crisis right now and worsening it by attacking the Rafah border, where only some of the only limited aid that is getting into Gaza is going through. I mean, I told you guys this statistic before, but it still blows my mind. The UN has basically a stage categorization of starvation and risk of famine. And it goes, I think, 1 through 5. Okay, 5 being the maximum risk of starvation. Okay, 80% of all people around the world who fall into that most severe stage 5 categorization are inside Gaza. Okay, this tiny little strip with a couple million people 80% of the stage 5 starvation categorized people in the world are inside Gaza. And they're talking about worsening this situation by attacking Rafah right now. Okay? They say the threat to suspend the Camp David Accords, a cornerstone of regional stability for nearly a half century, came after Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said sending troops into Rafah was necessary to win the 4-month war against the Palestinian militant group Hamas. Guys, they are nowhere close to defeating Hamas, okay? It's not a complicated thing to understand. Hamas is an idea. It's not a set amount of troops that you go in and you kill and you take out some of their infrastructure or whatever, and then everybody goes on their merry way. That's not how this shit works. Okay, the only way that the so-called conflict with Israelis and Palestinians to get any sort of lasting peace is going to be a diplomatic solution. It is going to be a political solution, an end to the occupation, an end to the apartheid, an end to the illegal settlements and the ethnic cleansing in the West Bank, an end to the brutal genocidal bombing campaign inside of Gaza. That's like a starting point for an actual lasting peace. Going in and continuing this military campaign is not going to do anything but get us more dead Palestinian men, women, and children on our hands. That's all that this is going to do. They say that over half of Gaza's population of 2.3 million have fled to Rafah to escape fighting in other areas, which again, many of those other areas Israel had previously said were safe zones. They keep saying, oh, go south, you're going to be safe in the south. They were never safe. They were constantly bombing these areas, right? And they say that they were packed into sprawling tent camps and UN-run shelters near the border. Of course, UN-run shelters that Israel is probably bombing right now, claiming that they are like Hamas HQ. Right? Egypt fears a mass influx of hundreds of thousands of Palestinian refugees who may never be allowed to return. Right? I mean, 80% of residents have fled their homes inside of Gaza. 80%, it's almost the entire population of Gaza is internally displaced, with basically nowhere to return to because of how much destruction there has been so far. And then we also have this at the same time, which is not atypical. I mean, we've seen plenty of examples of official Israeli accounts putting out rampant misinformation and lies that are easily fact-checkable. But I mean, this was another one, right? The official Israel Twitter account here, and they're saying 11,000 trucks, 140,000 tons of food, water. Look at how much aid that we're giving the people of Gaza. They say Israel will continue to facilitate the transfer of life-saving humanitarian aid. Our war is with Hamas, not with the people of Gaza. And then you look at the image down here, right? And they're giving, oh, look at all the tents that we're giving the people of Gaza. Whoops. Turns out that this is from a couple years ago, back in 2022, and it was tents that were given to refugees from Ukraine. So you're literally using like fake stock photos from a completely different conflict from 2 years ago to try to justify how much aid you are giving to Palestinians in Gaza. I mean, it's just utterly absurd at this point. Do they think people can't fact check their statements? Right? I mean, at some point, you would almost think like the public embarrassment of constantly being caught lying would be enough for them to not make this mistake 100 times in just a couple months, right? But I mean, again, our war is with Hamas, not with the people of Gaza. I mean, guys, we've gone over all of the statistics. A vast majority of the people that they are killing in Gaza, they are civilians, right? Okay, how many Hamas commanders have you killed? Or even Hamas militants have you confirmed killed? I mean, at this point, maybe it's up to like 4,000, 5,000 if we're being really generous. You've killed over 30,000 people at this point. Okay, you've killed twice the amount if we're being generous with that 5,000 militants who have been killed. You've killed more than double the amount of just children. We've seen the previous statements from guys like President Isaac Herzog saying that there are no innocent civilians in Gaza, right? Or statements from Netanyahu himself to treat the Palestinians in Gaza like Amalek, where in that biblical verse they talk about killing every man, woman, child. I mean, we've seen all of the statements. We've seen your actions on the ground in Gaza so far. There is no possible way that you can convince any reasonable person who has seen what has happened over the last couple of months that this is some sort of a targeted war against Hamas. It's not. It's a war against the entire Palestinian population in Gaza, as well as an expansion of the violence towards Palestinians in the West Bank as well, right? So it's just a continuation of the status quo, really, if we're being honest. We also had a statement here from the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, who is, again, similar to Egypt, warning of very serious repercussions of storming and targeting the city of Rafah. Now, what does that mean? I mean, you can read this statement for yourself. They don't directly threaten anything. I mean, they're basically calling for like a cessation of the violence, a ceasefire, whatever. And, they're saying they shouldn't go in or there may be consequences. Who knows what that means? We have seen already, as I talked about previously on this channel, Saudi Arabia basically telling the United States to go fuck themselves when it comes to the normalization process with Israel unless and until there is a ceasefire in Gaza and the establishment of a Palestinian state along the 1967 UN recognized borders. So I mean, Biden is also at the same time as like, being complicit in genocide, he's also completely destroyed even his own targeted, foreign policy goals inside of the Middle East of this whole normalization process. And obviously this goes a lot back to the Trump administration, who moved the embassy to Jerusalem, the U.S. embassy, and was aggressively pushing forward with like the Abraham Accords that intentionally and explicitly left out Palestinians, pretended as if that issue didn't exist whatsoever, and arguably influenced the situation leading to the Hamas attack inside of southern Israel on October 7th. And so all of this is just coming full circle at this point. I mean, you're shooting yourself in the foot, even from your own, sort of like right-wing hawkish perspective of what foreign policy in the Middle East should look like, and trying to cozy up with these dictators, right? Now, a couple other things before I end off the video here. We've also had so many videos, and I had to mention this, of looting that is taking place by IDF troops inside of Gaza. Okay, I mean, this one, they say, oh, it's from Khan Yunis. It's this mirror that I guess somebody just stole from a Palestinian's house. I've showed you the TikTok videos of IDF soldiers like proudly rummaging through people's shit. We've also seen, here's another one, an Israeli Filipino soldier, Aaron Raphael, stationed in Ramal, in West Gaza City, posted a TikTok video hours ago showing him looting Palestinian homes, and like he's literally flexing the watches in his hand. I mean, there's a fucking baby, a baby cradle right there. Right? And he's holding like multiple watches, showing them off, publicly posting this on TikTok. I mean, they're proud of this, right? This isn't some leaked thing that we got from some back channel Israeli intelligence service or something like that. They're publicly posting this. So how do you do this kind of thing? How do you constantly post the TikToks that we have seen of them doing like basically like skits, like what they think are comedy skits inside of Gaza as they're in the midst of this genocidal war? I mean, how do you do that unless you do not view Palestinians as human beings, unless your entire military apparatus is willing to look the other way or even endorse these kinds of things, right? Because we just covered a couple of days ago the IDF being caught running that Telegram channel that was basically just like snuff, gore videos for the Israeli population to look at of them killing Palestinians in Gaza. So, I mean, this is like part and parcel of the entire operation that we have seen. We also had another statement here from this terrorist, Itar BenGavier, and I think it's fair to call him that. I mean, the man has literally been convicted of helping to incite terrorism. And so Itar BenGavier, he says basically that they shouldn't hesitate. There cannot be a situation in which children and women approach us from the wall. Anyone who approaches in order to harm security must receive a bullet. Otherwise, we'll see October 7th again. So endorsing shooting innocent children and women because what, they walked funny, they walked up to you in some way, or they were in your vicinity and you got spooked? I mean, is that what we're talking about here? So just the latest insanity from him. And then also from Israeli media. I mean, I won't play this clip, I'll link it down below if you want to go watch the whole thing. But like, guys, I mean, this is like a very right wing, I think this is like a Netanyahu aligned channel inside of Israel, channel 14. But I mean, some of the shit that they say, I mean, this is even crazy like for a U.S. audience, right? I mean, think about the crazy shit that we hear on Fox News and even on like CNN and MSNBC. I mean, they're just saying that you will die, you will starve, we will burn your homes, let them starve to death, we will not leave Gaza. I mean, this other guy, he says, we will take your lands and build settlements over them. Only then they'll realize we've won. I mean, this guy says, I don't feel sorry for Gazans. I don't think there should be a single person who feels sorry for the people of Gaza, not for the elderly, not the youth, and not for the children. But for the people of Gaza, for me, let them starve to death. So, I mean, what do you say at this point? It's just a fundamentally broken, reactionary, fascist society for the most part. And it's not everybody. There have been plenty of people who have been protesting Netanyahu's government inside of Israel, going and making their voices heard that they're in favor of a ceasefire, that they want some sort of a hostage negotiation process to play out. I'm not saying it's everybody, but a huge portion of the Israeli civilian population, if anything, thinks that maybe the IDF, according to polling data, isn't doing enough, that they aren't being aggressive enough. And so what do you say at that point? When this is the kind of government that is allowed to remain in power, that is allowed by the United States of America, by Western Europe, to do what they are doing in Gaza, to starve the people of Gaza, to launch offensives in every single inch, every corner of Gaza, okay, where a vast majority, an overwhelming majority of the deaths have been innocent men, women, and children, but even just women and children make up a majority of the deaths so far. When every single mosque and school and hospital, has been targeted in this operation. And the best that you get from leaders like Joe Biden is like, well, I'm frustrated behind the scenes at Bibi, right? Or what was that other quote, right? Oh, it's been over the top. Oh, it's been over the top. You don't say. I mean, you're talking about you being complicit in a genocide, and you're saying, oh, they're going over the top a little bit, and then proceeds to do absolutely nothing about it, and in fact does the opposite of nothing about it, but continues to give them and to push to give them billions of dollars in completely unchecked aid. I mean, guys, Congress, in this most recent package that they've been negotiating, with like an extra $14 billion sprinkled on top the billions we already give Israel, Congress decided willingly, by their own volition, to put in a measure inside of that bill that says Congress will have no oversight over the funding we are giving to Israel. They're stripping away their own ability to do oversight on the aid that we are giving. What the fuck does that say about our government? That they are willingly putting that in. They don't even want to look at whether or not Israel is in violation of the law, right? Because, as a reminder, it's against U.S. law. It's against international law to aid and abet a genocide, but it's also against U.S. law for us to be sending weapons and giving this kind of aid and military support to any country that is even in violation of international law or human rights law. And obviously that applies to Israel. But they refused to do any official reports. They refused to look into it. Congress voted against Bernie Sanders' bill just to get that report from the State Department. So, I mean, it's just an absolute sick joke at this point. And, this offensive into Rafah in southern Gaza, it, number one, could lead to a potential escalation where Egypt feels as though they need to get more seriously involved. So it could lead to a dramatic, breakdown of relations between those two countries, as well as with obviously like Saudi Arabia as well, and other potential neighboring elements like Hezbollah and the Houthis as well. So it could lead to a dramatic escalation. And then on top of that, obviously the humanitarian consequences of this are going to be somehow even worse than what we have already seen so far.